What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. Welcome back, everyone. Today's episode is going to go a little bit differently than previous episodes have, but this is hopefully something that I'll continue doing moving forward into the future. In today's episode, I brought in Dr. Ron Snarr, who is an assistant professor of health and kinesiology at Georgia Southern University, as well as their director of the Human Performance Laboratory. And in this episode, we talked all things high-intensity interval training. There's often a lot of misconception and some myths surrounding this topic. And so I found this episode personally pretty insightful, and I hope you enjoy this episode as well. All right, sweet. So I was super excited to get you on the podcast because and I tell my fiance this, but you were the person who got me into research, got me excited about it. And it was way back in 2013, I think, when you were at ASU teaching that introductory strength
conditioning.
And you brought in your thesis one day, and I just remember thinking it was the coolest thing ever. And I was like, God, I want to do research or at least know more about it. And then we started writing. I think that next year we got a couple of smaller papers.
Yeah, I think what do we got, 12 together overall? It's 10 to 12.
Yeah. And it's funny because whenever my current boss looks at my CV, she forgets that I had 12 publications before I even started working with her. And I've still published a couple since I started working with her. You got stuff published on kettlebell training? When did you do that? Yeah, it's just totally sense.
Yeah, why is my name not on that?
But so I obviously know a little bit about you, but just for those listening, just give them a brief background as to who you are and what you do right now.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Dr. Ron Snarr. I am currently an assistant professor of exercise science at Georgia Southern University. And my background is basically in exercise performance, strength and conditioning, personal training. I have my PhD from University of Alabama, my master's degree from Auburn University in exercise science. I'm also currently finishing up a biostatistics master's here at Georgia Southern. So a lot of the stuff I do in the lab that I run here, the Human Performance Lab, is a lot of fitness myths. And we like to bust a lot of fitness myths. We do a lot of strength training, human performance, athletic performance for all the Division I teams we have here on campus. But we also work with a lot with the fire department, police department in terms of tactical athletes. Right now, it's not just limited to athletics. I also do a lot with diabetic populations, clinical populations, and we kind of touched on that when we were at Arizona State a little bit. I know you went that route more than I did, but also current work, we're working with high-intensity interval training. We're doing virtual reality studies. We're working with, like I said, the fire department on just finished up a 10-month intervention on health and wellness. And then currently just actually finished up co-editing and authoring the 3rd edition of NSCA's Essentials of Personal Training textbook.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, it's cool to see all the stuff that you've done since I knew you back at ASU 6, 7, 8 years ago.
It's been a while. It's been 7 years.
Yeah, I know. I can't believe it's flown by already. So is that where... So most people out there listening have probably seen the Man with a Board Instagram page. I'm assuming that's kind of where you got the idea of Scientists with a Board for that Instagram page.
I don't follow a lot of social media, but my students obviously do, and so I have seen the dude with a sign or whatever you call him, and I did kind of pawned it off. But one day my students are saying to me that because I always bust myths in class, I always break their hearts about what training is, what training is not, and what supplements work, what doesn't. Yeah. So they said, you should do this, on Instagram. And so I said, all right, whatever, I'll give it a shot. And so that's what I started to do, just put up one-liners up there to kind of tell people, here's what it is. We see a lot of this bad information being passed around on social media. Yeah. And it's growing so much at an exponential rate now more than ever, right? Everybody's being kind of quarantined and shut in, so everybody's publishing their home workouts and home advice or advice on how to boost immunity, right? Everybody's got a supplement company starting every other week. Yeah. Right? But do these things work? And everybody buys into this stuff, and it's hard to really tell people, no, stop, slow down. That's not what it is. And you're getting some false information here. And so that's why I kind of started that board. It's actually tough to keep up with. I don't do a lot of social media stuff. So every day trying to come up with these things is fun. And I laugh about it. And then people get all riled up when you tell them all these little fitness myths that aren't true. But everybody, I think, in our field of health, fitness, exercise, wellness, whatever you want to call it, is an expert. Everybody who's worked out one time is now an expert. I lost 5 pounds, I'm an expert.
Yeah.
And so that's what kind of the page is about. Just getting this information out there, maybe one line at a time, but it's out there.
Yeah, no, it was cool. And anyone who is listening who doesn't follow it should go follow it, because you got already like 1,500 followers in probably a month or so of setting it up.
Yeah, about that. So
yeah, no,
I don't know if that's a lot. Is that a lot? Is that a little? I don't know.
I mean, it's better than I'm doing on my own Instagram page. I was like, damn it. But no, it's really cool. And I think what's cool about it is I've kind of always had that same interest in helping to dispel like myths and some misinformation that I see out there, especially because I worked as a personal trainer for like 6 years. And I got so fed up with even like personal trainers who like maybe didn't have like a bachelor's degree or didn't really have, because I worked with some personal trainers who didn't even have a certification. You know, they'd be spouting out misinformation. And so it's like, I can't like really say anything, obviously, but I always wished there was more sources that were like putting out, I guess, like the truth and dispelling some of those myths. And there are, obviously, but I think it's cool that you added the humor aspect to it with, you know, kind of a spin-off of the dude with a sign, because it like catches people attention, and then they're like, oh, you know, this is cool. And they get a laugh out of it, but they also learn something hopefully from it.
Oh, for sure. I've been testing little things out too. I mean, I put up a trivia question to test it out, see if people wanted to engage in some sort of conversation. They hated the trivia. They don't want to do it. Nobody wants to guess. They just give me the answer. But it's insane how many people will debate you, or you know, how many trainers will, or even just regular, you know, Joe Schmo comes out of the woodwork and says, no, you're wrong. And I say, well, here's the science. I'm not going to, I just say, here's it. It's not my opinion. It's just the science. And then they just say, no, you're wrong. And I say, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's
otherwise I'd be on there arguing for 20 hours a day, just going back and forth.
Yeah. No, it's funny. And even with, you know, you have a PhD, and I'm sure you probably have gotten some hate mail from people who like don't have any kind of degree in exercise science, and they're like telling you what's right and wrong. And you're like, this is just what the science is. I'm not like saying that, you know, I know everything. And this is I
have no vested interest in making money from that thing. It's like, I'm not selling you anything. I am not trying to get, you know, the people, they want to believe the people who are selling them the product more than the people telling them to save their money.
Right.
And I'm just like, it's not going to work. What do you know? Okay.
Yeah. No, it's a cool thing. And so I think more people should go follow it, so they hopefully are kept up to date on what science is actually telling us is maybe right and what might be wrong. So
and it's evolving, right? It's everything. That's our field of exercise science. It's so much evolved from the last 30 years. The next 30 years is going to be, you know, even greater.
Yep. So
if you think about it, 30 years ago, coaches didn't give their athletes water because they thought it was bad for them.
Right. Yep. And now we realize the importance of electrolytes. So no, it's cool. And it's kind of one of the things that I'm hoping to do with this podcast too, is just, you know, not say like, hey, I'm a know-it-all, but just be like, hey, look, this is what science says about a certain topic. So take it or leave it. You know, you can use it if you want, but you know, here's maybe what you might have thought. This was maybe a misconception, and here's what the science says about it. You know, take it or leave it. So
that's it.
So yeah, that's what we're gonna try and do today, is talk a little bit about HIIT or high intensity interval training, and I'm sure there will be some myths that we'll have to bust as we get into it. But just to start off, I'm sure most people who are athletes and coaches listening have heard of HIIT or high intensity interval training, because it's pretty common. But yeah, just how is it defined on a basic level, and then just give us like an example of what a high intensity interval training session might look like.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we even need to go back one step further just for interval-based training. You know, so interval-based training itself, not even HIIT, just interval-based training, right? Doing repeated intervals of short rest to work ratios, right? Doing something that's intense. Now that's a relative intensity, but then separated by that short period of rest. right? And so I think where everybody kind of got this confusion was perceptual, I'm working hard, okay, it's high intensity, right? And so what HIIT actually is, high intensity interval training, that's defined as any kind of interval-based program that is 90% of your VO2 max workload or greater, okay, with short rest periods in between. Now, it's the 90% VO2 max that is the thing that gets everybody. It's not heart rate based.
Right.
So just that simple clarification between heart rate and VO2 is where the big difference lies.
Right. Yeah. And so it's obviously, because it's greater than 90% of VO2 max, for those who know anything about what it's like to work at VO2 max, it's freaking hard. So you're working really, really, really hard. You're not just like working kind of hard. You're working really hard to do interval training.
Right. And most trained athletes or triathletes kind of know that VO2 max area. They know that level. Yeah. Right. They've probably done those tests or some sort of threshold test or right. And so they know what it's like to run at that level of VO2 max.
Yeah. It's pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah. And you're doing that workload or greater, right? So you can do a workload greater than VO2 max. So when you're doing that VO2 max test on a treadmill, right, then you have that workload that you've topped out at. Well, now for a HIIT session, I increase the workload. And that's where I do some of my HIIT training or my sprint interval training.
Right. Now, I guess one quick question that comes to mind, though, as you mentioned that, is most people, for practical reasons, obviously can't go into a lab and have their actual VO2 max measured. Right? So they don't have like their milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen that their VO2 max is.
Right.
So let's just say, for example, for practical purposes, most athletes usually use like heart rate based zones or pace or power zones if you're a cyclist. And even in running now, we're starting to see power meters. Can you still use those kind of training zones to help get a decent estimation of like working in a kind of VO2 max type training range or zone?
See, the tough part with using heart rate based zones, right? Heart rate is good for prescribing a nice submax, long duration kind of bout. But as soon as we start to throw in an interval at a high intensity, heart rate starts to go out the window as a good indicator of how hard we're working. Right. Because if you're doing a velocity greater than VO2 max, right, like a max sprint speed, right, that heart rate is going to top out around 85% of that VO2 max, and it's going to stay pretty much that same heart rate once I go past that velocity. Right. So heart rate starts to just top out. Even though we can start to sprint faster, heart rate still is near max, but we can still run faster. Right. Or heart rate does have a lag. Right, heart rate doesn't catch up as soon as we start. It has about a 2-minute lag. So by the time that interval might be done, now the heart rate is now peaked. Right, then I rest for my 30 seconds or a minute, and heart rate comes down, and then I start my interval again at a high fast rate. Well, that's not going to peak again until I hit the end of my interval again. Right, so that heart rate zone is tough to measure, especially with these short, quick sprint interval training based systems of 5 to 10 seconds. Heart rate's not going to jump up to 80-95% of your max in 5 to 10 seconds. Right. So it's very difficult to get that heart rate based zone to mimic VO2 max. Are they linear? Yes, they're linear, but that's not a 1-to-1 ratio. Right. So it might almost be better to use something like, if you don't have what your VO2 max is and what kind of velocity or power output is associated with it, it's probably best to use something like perceived exertion, just to know whether or not you're working at the right effort level. For sure. RP is much better indicator for sprint interval, high intensity intervals than heart rate. Right? Even just going out and running as fast as you possibly can for that 5 to 10 seconds. I mean, you know, if you can run faster. If you can run faster, then run faster. Right. Right. And I guess one kind of field test that someone might be able to do to get a decent estimation of what their VO2 max is just go out and go as hard as you could for, say, 5 to 6 minutes, right? Because it's kind of what VO2 max is the pace or effort for that you could hold for like 5 to 10 minutes, right? Yeah, it's going to differ by trained and untrained. Yeah. Right. For untrained, if you're starting out, you can do like a step test, right? You can do a 6-minute bike test where you can easily go into the gym and test that out. Right. Right. And just kind of change the wattage on the cycle. For more trained, yeah, you can do something like a 1.5 mile run and look at the time it took you to run that, right? Put it in the little equations they give you. Is there some error with it? Yeah, sure. But there's still error with the lab machine too that we use to do VO2 max. right? So it's going to give you a good starting point regardless.
Right. All right. Yeah. So testing and stuff aside though, now that we know kind of what high intensity interval training is from a definition standpoint, what are some of the benefits of doing HIIT sessions? Are most of the benefits related to improvements in VO2 max since you're working at that kind of effort level, or are there like other benefits outside of VO2
So
max?
most of the benefits that we see are going to actually go from untrained versus trained. And so with untrained individuals, if we're just starting out doing cardiovascular work, whether it's HIIT or whether it's, slow, steady state, continuous, moderate intensity exercise, whatever you want to say, most of that's just going to improve VO2 max. But most of that VO2 max adaptation is coming from increased mitochondrial density, right? Increased capillary density, increased stroke volume at rest and submax. And that's why heart rate kind of drops, because we have that compensation during cardiac output for the increase in stroke volume. A lot of the compensation comes from blood volume, right? Getting that hypervolemia increase. We have basically increased blood volume, increased capacity to transport red blood cells and oxygen to the working skeletal muscle. So for the most part, in untrained individuals doing any type of cardiovascular training, that's where you're going to see the most adaptation. Right? But you're also going to see enzyme change. So enzymes are going to increase for fat oxidation. Right? That way we can rely more on fat, less carbohydrates during exercise.
Right.
So if we rely more on fat during exercise instead of carbohydrate or glycogen, well then lactate production along with the hydrogen ions obviously goes down. That means that lactate threshold is going to go up. Right? We can sustain a given percentage of VO2 max because we are reducing the amount of hydrogen ions we're producing.
Right. So what about it?
What's that?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So that's pretty much the ones for untrained, but as trained, we see it's more of the capacity to utilize fat.
Okay.
Right? Because a highly trained individual, they're not going to get much more blood volume after they're already trained, right? They're not simply increasing blood volume all the time. Capillary density is already there. Mitochondrial density, it's there. Am I going to get a little more? Yeah, potentially, depending on the type of HIIT you do. But most of it's going to be just the actual function of the mitochondria is going to improve.
Right. So it's almost like, I like to always describe this kind of concept to athletes as working at really high intensities almost has kind of like a trickle down effect on your ability to hold lower intensities for longer. So like your threshold, like you're going to bump up your threshold and you can therefore run or cycle or swim just below your threshold for fat, you're going faster, right? For a longer period of time.
For sure.
And then can you also improve your VO2 max by doing HIIT training too? Or do you mostly see that in untrained individuals? And then at a certain point, like genetics will limit your ability to improve it further. And then your VO2 max doesn't improve that much and you kind of hit the ceiling.
Well, we do see obviously a genetic ceiling for VO2 max. For untrained individuals, once they hit about 60 mLs per kg, which is a transition to highly trained, right? They go from untrained to about 60 mLs per kg per minute, which puts you in that elite category. Any further increase in volume of submax continuous exercise doesn't show any change in VO2 max for an individual. So just continually doing long runs doesn't really change VO2 max pretty much once you're highly trained, right? So with sprint interval training and high intensity interval training, we do see some changes in VO2 max. There is a lot of conflicting research. Some people don't change at all VO2 max, but performance goes up because they've now changed the functional capacity of the mitochondria, or they've gotten actually a little more blood volume, or they've changed some sort of other enzyme activity, right? Whereas some people, VO2 still keeps going up. So it is kind of individual variation there.
Yeah, you almost got to pick your parents wisely and make sure they have a really good VO2 max if you want.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And then I'm sure some of that obviously also in terms of like practically doing it in real life, you got to make sure that you're doing HIIT correctly. So let's maybe like give a brief example of what a HIIT session might look like. And we can use perceived exertion, as a way of prescribing intensity, but what would like a 20 to 30 minute HIIT session look like so people can kind of wrap their minds around it?
Yeah, for sure. So there's about 4 or 5 different types of HIIT itself. So HIIT's more of an umbrella term.
Okay.
Right. So we got long HIIT intervals, you got short HIIT intervals, you have repeated sprint intervals, then you have basically just explosive sprints that are only about 1 to 3 sets at the very fastest you can go, right? Repeated sprints a little slower. HIIT long sessions. So HIIT long sessions are about 90% of your VO2 max workload. That's where that's going to start. Okay, so they're actually the bottom in terms of the ones you can do. So a long interval, so if it's like a triathlon like you do, right? So a long interval for triathletes, you're looking at about a 1 to 8 minute work duration at 90 to 100% of your VO2 max. Yeah. That's so brutal. Obviously you're going to build up over time. You're not going to start out with the 8-minute one.
Right.
So you're going to have a 1 to 8 minute work ratio, about a 1 to 3 minute rest ratio. Now, obviously manipulation of those variables is important, right? And that's some trial and error with your individual athlete, but you're going to do that basically for about 1 to 5 sets. And then you would accumulate over that time, maybe about 12 to 30 minutes of actual work.
Okay.
Right, so that's a long interval. So that's pretty long, right? A lot of people aren't going to start out with those. But if you've got into like the short intervals, you're looking at about 20 to 60 seconds. Now the VO2 max is going to be higher because the interval is shorter, right? We've got to create metabolic stress. So we're looking at about 100 to 140% of your VO2 max workload, right? At 60 seconds. Yeah, that's a lot. Yep. So work to rest ratios there is like that 1 to 1, maybe a 1 to 0.5 kind of work to rest ratio.
Right. And you said for the longer efforts that are 1 to 8 minutes, a 1 to 3 work to rest ratio.
Right. You're going to build, like, if you need more time, then take the more time, right? Because people just starting out at these 1 minute of VO2 max, sometimes that'll kill you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Cause it's almost, and I kind of preach this a lot to athletes too, but especially when you're doing like really high end hard work, it's about the quality that you're doing and the really hard efforts, not necessarily like going really hard and then minimizing your rest so that your like overall pace on your run looks good. It's about going really, really hard and then making sure you recover properly. So I guess, yeah, the more rest you need so that you can then go again really hard the next effort. That's important.
Oh, that's 100% correct. Right. Yeah. So we see like, even in research, when they have like 8 sets and they start manipulating the rest periods, well, as you shorten the rest period, the intensity of the following sets, 5, 6, 7, 8, start to decrease in the metabolic demand.
Right.
So those sets that you did at the end weren't actually any benefit to you.
Right.
You literally didn't create enough metabolic stress to get any benefit from those last 4 sets because you shortened the rest period too much to where it wasn't even worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. So rest period is important. That's good. It's good. So hopefully the athletes that I coach are listening and they hear it now from someone else outside of just me. And does the intensity of the rest period matter? Like, is there a specific threshold you want to be below in terms of like VO2 max, like a percent of VO2 max?
Yep. So what we see is about 40% or lower of VO2 max is a good rest period.
Okay. Right. Which at that point, that's a pretty easy intensity.
Oh yeah. That's walking it off or just even a passive recovery, just jumping off the treadmill if you're doing treadmill sprints on and off.
Right. So going really, really hard and then making sure you recover in between each effort so you can go really hard again.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. So now that we've defined it, we know what it is, what it looks like. Let's talk about what HIIT is not, which is probably going to be a little bit more fun. So I'll let you open up this can of worms. And
oh, boy. So what HIIT is not? HIIT is not a lot of things, and this is going to break a lot of hearts. So when we do HIIT, you have to be at that metabolic demand, right? That VO2 max demand. And most of the stuff we see and most of the stuff I test in my lab, I've published multiple studies on these things, doing body weight circuits, doing circuits with some sort of implement like battle ropes, doing circuits with kettlebells or some sort of barbell complex, or just doing plyometrics does not elicit a high enough percentage of VO2 max to be considered HIIT. Now, will you gain some sort of small cardiovascular benefit? Potentially. If you're untrained individual, if you're unfit, like aerobically, most of these kind of circuits, body weight circuits, elicit about 50 to 64% VO2 max. Right now, for somebody who's unfit aerobically, sure, you can get some benefit out of it, but it just can't be considered HIIT the intensity is not high enough of a percent VO2 max to be classified as that. And a lot of people don't like that because they say, well, my heart rate's up. That's what cardio is. It's heart rate.
Right.
Well, that's a small aspect, and cardiovascular work is actually determined by metabolic stress.
Right. Right. Which is, and I'm pretty sure every single group fitness instructor out there just let out a collective sigh, and that you're going to get a crap ton of hate mail probably from every single group fitness instructor out there.
Every day of my life.
All right. So we know that circuit training with body weight and various types of full body movements isn't necessarily HIIT. What about, this is the other thing that I see a lot of too, and I'm not going to bash on CrossFit by any means, but CrossFit I feel like is where I saw it first. But the use of plyometrics amidst other types of circuits and high intensity full body movements, the use of plyometrics in HIIT training, or to be, quote unquote HIIT training. What are some things related to that?
I mean, just plyometrics in general. It doesn't have to be CrossFit based, but plyometrics in general, we see it, everybody on social media putting the jump squats or burpees or anything, just box jumps or, anything. So with plyometrics, it's a very anaerobic movement, right? And with plyometrics is kind of, if we're doing jump squats, it's jump. All right. We have some time actually in the air to rest, come down, right? We land and we go back into the movement, right? You have to think of the biomechanical and metabolic comparisons between a jump squat and sprinting. Right? Sprinting, the turnover is so fast and repetitive. There's more of a demand for energy than doing a jump squat. Additionally, with sprints, you're using max. That's max effort, right? Doing a jump squat to you, is that a max effort for 5 seconds? No, right? Sprint as fast as you can for 5 to 10 seconds and then do a couple jump squats for 5 to 10 seconds. What's going to actually be metabolically harder?
Yeah, the sprint.
It's going to be the sprinting, right? Because it's literally using everything you got to move your body weight that fast. Now, most people, doing a body weight squat for 20 on, 10 off, and that's a whole other ballgame with the Tabata stuff. It's not going to elicit that much of a metabolic demand. Right? Now, if you're untrained, sure, like I said, you might get some benefit from it. But once you start to get used to that stimulus, you need to do something else. And being able to do maybe 1 more or 2 more jump squats within that 20 seconds is still not going to elicit enough of that demand to qualify as HIIT training.
Yeah. So it almost seems like in order to do HIIT training properly, it has to be some type of, like total body cardiovascular movements, so like running, cycling, swimming. I mean, if you're a cross country skier, you could obviously do it cross country skiing, whatever it is. So it can't per se be a combination of strength training movements. You would ideally like it to be some type of cardiovascular activity to do it properly.
See, even with that, we can bring in a debate of like battle ropes, for instance.
Okay.
Right? Battle ropes, upper body conditioning. You can go hard as fast as you want with those kind of battle ropes, but even there, we've looked at the metabolic demand with 1 minute rest in between, 30 seconds all out, 1 minute rest. We only see a metabolic ratio of about 50% VO2 max. And these were untrained individuals.
Interesting.
So you would think, it's going to be hard for them. Would they get some benefit? Sure, the minimal benefit we see for anybody is around 50% VO2 max for cardiovascular adaptation, about 50%. So they might get the bare minimum of some sort of upper body cardiovascular work, but the stimulus is just not there to be considered high-intensity interval training.
Right. Yeah. And for most, triathletes and runners and cyclists and swimmers, they're just going to probably do HIIT training with their method, with the sport that they're doing, right?
Right, for sure.
So
that's specific.
Right. And so we know circuit training, the use of plyometrics maybe isn't the best way to do HIIT. Is there anything else that you've seen out there that like someone tried to call HIIT that was just ridiculous? Or
I see a lot of interesting things on social media now that I'm on there more. I think one of the biggest misconceptions with HIIT is Tabata stuff. Right? Tabata, what people know as Tabata is the 20 on, 10 off.
Okay.
Right? The 20 seconds of work, 10 seconds of rest. No matter what you do, it's called a Tabata because it's 20 on, 10 off.
Right.
Well, the original study that came from was Dr. Tabata in 96, I believe. Right? He did just a work to rest ratio that was just 2 to 1. It just happened to be that work to rest ratio. And what he did was take recreationally trained students, and he put them on a cycle. Gave them a VO2 test, determined what that was for that level. For the next couple of weeks, how he trained them was 170% of the workload of VO2 max.
Okay.
So imagine your workload, and now 170% of your workload. It's like doing repeated wind gates.
Right. Awful. It's terrible.
Yeah. Repeated wind gates for 8 rounds of 20 on, 10 off. Right. And so a lot of people start to do, well, I'm going to do a Tabata. It's 20 on, 10 off. Yes, but you need to do the workload if you're going to call it that Tabata.
Right.
And now they're doing body weight circuits or jump squats or whatever they're doing. Right. It's going to work in terms of getting muscular benefit and muscular endurance. Right. For some people, build some strength and maybe build some muscle. You're getting benefit out of doing those things. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying they're not HIIT. Right. And so the Tabata stuff, he did other studies that were different work to rest ratios, but that's the one that people stick with. And so they think they're going to get the same adaptation. Everybody lost weight, they lost body fat, and, aerobic capacity went up and anaerobic capacity went up. But just doing these jumping around your living room, it's not going to get the same results as the study got.
Right. So I guess Tabata is like almost a form of HIIT training, right? If done correctly.
If done properly.
Right.
If done correctly. Right.
Okay. Yeah. And it's funny because I feel like what happens is whether it's, some type of protocol from a research study or not, or from like a coach, and then, you get this trickle down effect where someone else hears about it, they tweak it a little bit. Someone else hears about it, they tweak it. And then pretty soon you got everyone doing like burpees and jump squats, for 30 on, 30 off, and thinking they're doing HIIT. And that's how all these, kind of misconceptions come
for
about.
sure. I mean, we've done multiple studies on metabolics, with suspension trainers. We did some on some of the WODs, right? So workout of the days, where it was 5, let me get this right in my head, 5 body weight squats or 5 pull-ups, 10 body weight squats, 15 push-ups, whatever it was. I don't remember off the
Yeah.
Right. And so we looked at the metabolic demands. It was 20 minutes of as many rounds as possible of those 3 things, right? 5 pull-ups, 10 squats, 15 push-ups, as many rounds as possible. People were getting, 15, 20 some rounds. That's a lot of work in 20 minutes. That's pushing it. So these people were near max heart rate the whole time, but the average VO2 response we saw was only about 63, 64%.
Crazy.
And they were booking it for a solid 20 minutes. There was no rest for these individuals. They were killing it.
Yeah, I've done that workout before a long time ago, and it's horrible. It's horrible. Yeah, it's absolutely brutal to try and do that for 20 minutes.
Now, do you think it's high intensity? Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
But metabolically, it's not. And it's just how the body works. That's just physiology. I didn't make it up. I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Funny. So I guess to like make this more relevant to endurance athletes, how would an endurance athlete who's training for, swim, bike, run, or swimming, cycling, running, integrate HIIT into like an actual HIIT workout into their training? Let's just say they're your average endurance athlete and they're, not building for a specific event or a specific race. They're just an endurance athlete looking to build some fitness. How could they incorporate it into their training plan?
Oh, for sure. I think there's a few things you got to think about beforehand before you start incorporating HIIT. So one is the individual, right? One is big key thing, individual. So any team sport, you don't want to really put them on the same type of HIIT altogether, because you're going to get only one type of outcome from that style of HIIT. And so if it's a long base duration HIIT session, like I said, that 1 to 8 minute, right, that's going to build that aerobic endurance and aerobic capacity. Whereas if you're doing repeated sprints, you're going to get a different outcome. Right? That's going to build the buffering capacity, basically, of hydrogen ions. So you got to really look at the metabolic demand of what each individual is lacking in and how to improve that specific thing. So the athletic profile, super, super important. Then you got to look at the long-term training adaptation. Right? Is this kind of a big mesocycle? Are we doing like a macro that's 4 years like the Olympics? Are we doing, are we competing all year long? So then it's really crucial when you're going to implement HIIT Are we going to start right before the competition season, a couple weeks out? Because that's when it shows the best results within a few weeks. Right? Or do we need just to build base?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're just trying to build base, the athletes came back from the summer, right, and we want to build that base again, I say general conditioning is your main priority, right? Instead of trying to incorporate HIIT right away and do all this, just build that base back, right? Once they start to get the base back, then we can see where we're lacking individually. And then we can start to piece out different HIIT sessions for each individual. I know that's a lot of work, right? But it's crucial for the individual. Right? And especially for the triathlete, it's an individual almost based sport, right? There are teams, but it is individual in nature. So training periodization, you want to make sure mostly it's undulating, right? Because you're going to have a high intensity HIIT day. Well, you don't want to follow that up from another high intensity long run day, right? It's going to be your slow, almost a tempo run, but a short duration.
Right. So, yeah. So I guess it almost depends, right? It's kind of the short answer. Yeah. And it's funny because I guess a lot of the answers to like exercise science, coaching, periodization questions is usually just, I find myself saying it depends, you know, kind of like what you said. It depends on the time of year. It depends on what you're focusing on during this specific mesocycle and this part of the periodization plan. And so, yeah, I guess the takeaway is you don't just do it all the time, all year round necessarily. It's something that you would strategically work into hopefully you're following a periodized plan if you're an endurance athlete out there, and you're a long-term endurance athlete, but you strategically place it in during specific points in the year when you're trying to work on those specific adaptations.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to remember is that there's different types of HIIT, and the different types of HIIT have different outcome base. Right. So like I said, if you want to work on buffering capacity and the ability to improve lactate threshold, well, that's going to be a specific type of HIIT. That's going to be that repeated sprint to where it's right in the 20 to 60 second range where we're producing the most hydrogen, right? That lactate threshold is going to be really tested. But if we want to kind of improve aerobic endurance at a higher rate, then we might do that 1 to 8 minute session, right? A little bit lower VO2 max speed, but a longer duration. I want to be able to sustain this kind of higher intensity for a longer period, right? So there are different ways to train that system. It's not just, I'm going to go all out for 5-10 seconds and that's it. That's all the HIIT there is. There's a lot of different styles. So I think just reading into these and what we really need as the outcome is the important goal here. Right? And I think the other thing is recovery as well. Right? If you're going to do this high intensity stuff, make sure it's not the day before a competition or 2 days before. You know, if you're going to do it, leave that buffer window about 3 days, potentially 2, if it's going to be 2 days out from a competition. Right? You're probably not going to be wanting to do the 8 minutes long duration, you know, kind of 10 sets.
Yeah. And that actually kind of goes into another question that I had was, and it's kind of getting into how you would, I guess, be mindful of how much intensity you're doing over the course of, a week or a month. Because obviously you can't just go hard all the time, and a HIIT training session, when done properly, obviously carries with it a much bigger physiological toll than, say, doing like a 30-minute easy run. So if you do a high intensity interval training session, is this something that you want to be doing multiple times a week or just once a week? What does that kind of distribution of intensity look like across a week?
So unfortunately, it's the same answer. It depends.
Right.
So is this a sport where we're having multiple competitions, right, every week? Right, with some sports, is there a sport where it's, 1 month I'm doing a race once a month, or maybe every couple months? So you got to really look at the demands of that week as well. Right? What periodization kind of phase am I in? Am I in a sprint interval phase, or am I in a long duration or some kind of undulating phase to where I'm just conjugating everything? And so, for instance, if you're in season, we see with like even just American football, ice hockey, all those kinds of sports where it's multiple games per week. We see even improvements in outcomes if we do HIIT twice a week. We can still see where we're supposed to be doing maintenance phase in season, just using 2 HIIT sessions, nothing too crazy out of the ordinary, a few sets. We can still see improvements in time trials, even for swimming. We've seen competition time trials improve in season when we should be doing just maintenance kind of general aerobic conditioning work.
Right.
With only 2 sessions a week, right? Even 1 just to maintain.
Right. So again, it depends. So I guess a lot of people that probably will listen to this, and a lot of the type of athletes that I work with are like long distance triathletes. They'll focus on Ironman 70.3s, full distance Ironmans, a lot of runners who do marathons, half marathons, those types of things where their in season looks different than, like, say, a team sport athlete, where team sport athletes might be competing every weekend or multiple times a week. And even a lot of like short course triathletes who are racing sprint and Olympic distance races, for like the ITU or something, they'll oftentimes race like multiple times in a month. Whereas a lot of like longer distance athletes will race, maybe once every other month, or they'll do one race a month, or they'll try and peak for like one key Ironman at the end of a season. Would those types of athletes approach using HIIT different than, say, like a team sport athlete who is racing a couple times a month for 6 months out of the year?
Oh, for sure. Definitely. So basically it's for somebody, say, has a one race per every 3 months, right? The focus leading up for those first couple months is going to be that general base, like I said, but as you start to incorporate those HIIT sessions, you're only going to want to start to incorporate maybe one session per week. And then we build up that base. We see how it affects that athlete, right? Because then we're going to see that fatigue kind of set in if we're just trying to implement HIIT as well as all the other training. So there does have to be a lot of manipulation of durations and sets and intensities along with that, right? A lot of people start to jump into HIIT right away. They want to go full blast, right? And just try and go balls to the wall, but then they just crash. Right? They don't get adaptation. They start to overtrain. They start to lead to more injuries because now the volume has changed so much, right, that they're not accounting for the intensity of that volume. Right. And that's where that undulating periodization model comes in. So you got to see how each kind of HIIT interval is changing that athlete every couple of weeks.
Yeah. And this is obviously, because the answer is always it depends, it takes a little bit of knowledge of like periodization and how to manipulate different training variables in order to make something fit. So I'll have to make like a podcast on periodization just to help like get people who aren't familiar with what periodization even is kind of up to speed on some of the basics. But yeah, I think a couple important take home messages, especially for like self-coached athletes. If you have a coach, hopefully your coach knows this and they're kind of, somewhat strategically manipulating your training variables. But for self-coached athletes, I think you just got to be mindful of making sure that you have a reason for doing what you're doing, you're smart about it, and that you're doing the HIIT session the right way. So hopefully at the very least, listening to all this will help kind of shed some light on what HIIT isn't and then what it is, so that you're making sure if you are doing it, you're at least doing it correctly and you have a little bit of an idea as to why you're doing what you're doing.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And seeing how it affects you every time, because I know if I go into the lab and do a HIIT session, I'm toast for like 2-3 days. I'm useless.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder when you do the true HIIT style at VO2 max. Your velocity of VO2 max, you're going in there. If you've never done a VO2 max test, it's brutal. It wipes you out for a day or two.
Oh yeah. And VO2 max focused sessions are they're probably the worst type of training sessions I think you could possibly do, because it's like
you are literally calling on every energy system to produce as much energy as possible in that fast of a time, and the central nervous system is just wiped out after that.
Yeah, I know. And so I know after I did a VO2 max focus session last week that was just horrible. It was a mix of like 3 to 4 minute efforts at, way above my threshold. Like I'm really, really working for those 3 to 4 minutes. And I did, 6-7 rounds of it. I was like literally hanging on for dear life by the end of it. And that's kind of how some of these HIIT sessions should go. They're not just like moderately uncomfortable. They're like really, really, really hard work for relatively short periods of time. And then they should kind of tax you for a day or two. So it's not like you're just doing HIIT session day in, day out and just, because then you're not going to get the benefit of doing it, because you're going to be so fatigued from doing so many hard sessions back to back that then pretty soon you're not going to be working at the metabolic demands you need to be working at to get the benefit of it.
That's the same thing I tell for resistance training. You go in the gym, you're like, I'm going to hit it hard this week. You hit 2-3 days of hard, high intensity volume. What happens on that 4th, 5th day? You're done. Now you're sick. You want to sleep all day. You're useless. But I think the biggest thing is with HIIT, the point of HIIT basically in a nutshell is to stress the body to the point to where that's what the competitive level feels like, right? Because we can't really mimic race day in, day out with training. And the point is to get better of adapting to that race day stimulus. Mm-hmm. So with HIIT, if I go above race day stimulus, if I'm booking it the whole time, even if it's for a minute or two, my body's going to adapt to being at intensity levels that high. Mm-hmm. Right? If I'm just continually going, okay, submax, 60 minutes, 120 minutes of submax exercise, and then I get to race day and I try and go all out, that's not going to work too well.
Yeah, you're gonna crumble pretty quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this was good. I think there's a lot of good stuff in here for those to get some more information on HIIT and what it is and mm-hmm. kind of how to incorporate it into their training. So what are some ways of either asking you more questions about this if they have more questions, or just keeping up with you and some of the things that you do in general? Obviously, they can go follow you at Scientist with a Board on Instagram. But what about some of the other ways of getting in touch with you?
So I do have a Twitter account. I don't post much, but I do have one. Okay. It's R.Snarr Fitness. And then I'm on ResearchGate as well for those researchers out there who know what ResearchGate is.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. Like I said, I'm pretty much stay off social media too much, but now I got to figure it out. So
yeah, cool. Well, at least you have the Scientist with a Board, so at the very least they can shoot you a message through there if they.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, cool, awesome. All right, well, I'll be sure to link those into the show notes below so they have them. But yeah, any more parting nuggets of wisdom you want to give on HIIT training, or do you feel like we pretty much covered most of the basics?
I think the last thing to really think about when you are trying to put in HIIT into your program is basically start slow. Don't try and go all out. Add one HIIT day a week. And if you're unsure of what HIIT is going to be for you, go out to the track, go into the treadmill, go into a bike, right? And start to ramp up that intensity every few minutes. Do a small sprint, 10 to 15 seconds, all out. Okay, well, could I have gone harder for that 10 to 15 seconds? Yes. Okay, well, take a break for a few minutes, ramp it up a little bit, right? Go all out another 15 seconds. Yeah, I was there. I barely hung on though for that 15 seconds. I started to decline in the last few seconds there. Okay, drop it down a little. That's probably going to be a good starting point for you. So it is trial and error, but if you can last for that 15 seconds without degrading in intensity, or maybe cycling, you start to slow down, or swimming, you start to slow down, mm-hmm. then maybe kick it back one little notch the next round and see how that feels. Because as we start to degrade over those seconds, that becomes that useless time. We're not eliciting that metabolic demand. So that's just a quick, easy trial that I tell people. If you want to implement HIIT, try and just go do some sprints, see how it feels, remember the intensity or whatever the speed was on the treadmill, whatever, and start there next time. Right? Yep. The first day might be a familiarization trial. You might just be getting that speed for next time. That's all.
Yeah, cool. So just kind of getting comfortable with how to pace it and how to push yourself at that kind of level, and then just being smart about it, and then making sure that you're doing it the right way and you're focusing on quality efforts.
For sure. Rest period. If you need to rest longer, then rest longer. Right.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. I love it. Well, yeah, it was good. It was good catching up with you too, and kind of chatting about some of our past time together and some of the classes that I was in that you taught. But yeah, this was good. Good luck with the rest of your research that you got going on, and all those classes you're teaching too.
Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Awesome. Cheers. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you're listening to us on iTunes and you have a free moment, go ahead and leave us a review. Those reviews are very much appreciated. And if you know of anyone who would be interested in following along to our podcast, please be sure to share this episode with them and let them know to subscribe.